Hey, you could have watched this video a day early. Check out my Patreon for more details. Hello everybody. Welcome to a sort of off-the-cuff retrospective of my history with the Nintendo DS line of consoles. I just want to go back in time and talk about my collection of Nintendo DS consoles, because I do have a good number of stories that I can tell, and it's interesting to look at the evolution of the first Nintendo DS all the way down to where the 3DS ended up, and eventually the 2DS. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with the very first Nintendo DS, all the way back in, I believe, 2004. And I got this right around that time, 2004, 2005. And this was a big one. This was definitely an interesting console to come out at the time because two screens, you know, the whole thing was that it was two screens, one of them was a touch screen. And I think for me, the biggest thing about the DS at the time was just because it was the next Nintendo console. I obviously was a big Nintendo boy growing up, so, you know, back then I would just eat up anything Nintendo would publish, and honestly still kind of now, but, you know, whatever. For me, this is gonna sound really funny. I had not played a Super Nintendo console before I had played a Nintendo DS. This was the first Nintendo handheld to have A, B, X, and Y, all four face buttons like you would commonly see on a Super Nintendo or the like. But you gotta remember, for me, handheld Nintendo consoles were the Game Boy line of consoles. You know, they had two face buttons. They just had A and B and L and R. You didn't have other handhelds at the time that had the four face buttons, so that was honestly a big deal for me, personally. I also just genuinely appreciated the ability to take your Game Boy Advance games and just play them on your Nintendo DS just like normal. This rendered the GBA kind of obsolete in my brain, but I still held on to it. I don't know why, but I'm glad I did because I was able to mod it and do all this other cool stuff with it. A link to that video is gonna be in the description down below. Let's also not forget that one of the launch games for the Nintendo DS was Super Mario 64 DS. So a fully fledged 3D open world Mario game being playable on this hunk of junk? Like, that was a big deal back in the day. I mean, with the power of hindsight, we're able to kind of look at Mario 64 DS as not really the best way to play Super Mario 64, just because you had to play it with the D-pad and a run button at the time. Now, a lot of people did not appreciate this style of control for a Mario 64 game. Me personally, I actually got super used to it, and I was totally fine with it. But let's be fair, I was a child, and children don't really have the best, they don't have the best logic or reasoning when it comes to their taste in things. You know, I just liked Mario 64 DS because it was Mario 64 on my DS, and, you know, that was just cool to me. One of the other big games that I always played on my Nintendo DS, and is actually one of the two Nintendo DS games I think of when I think of this specific model of the handheld, is Warioware Touched. Fun fact, when I actually got my hands on this specific model of DS, the first game I played on it was Warioware Touched. Not only was this a relatively close launch title for the system, it was the first game I played on the Nintendo DS as a whole. I mean, there was also Mario 64 DS, which was a genuine launch title, but if memory serves correct, I think WarioWare Touched was the first game I ever played on the system. It was a long time ago for me, and my memory doesn't really hold up all that well. But let's also not forget one of the big things Nintendo bundled in with the DS when it launched. It bundled in a demo of Metroid Prime Hunters, a 3D Metroid Prime game being played on the DS. I explored every little nook and cranny that this demo had to offer. I played it so many goddamn times, and I beat it God knows how many times, and I was so excited for the final game when it came out. I got it several years later after the launch of the Nintendo 3DS. Going back to this demo and the real game that released later, it's a very interesting type of game because it's a first-person shooter on the DS, and everyone has their own opinions on this game, especially Metroid fans. Me personally, I think this game does not hold up very well just because of its control schemes. Because let's be honest, you try playing a Metroid Prime game by holding your fucking stylus along the screen and sliding it all around and aiming with the D-pad and everything. It's not great. But this was one of my earliest times ever playing a Metroid game, period. And I thought Samus was one of the coolest fucking characters ever, even back then. and I didn't get into her games until, I don't know, Metroid Other M came out, which I know, but this being one of the earliest examples of me actually playing a Metroid game, and it was still really fun and really cool, especially at the time. Another funny thing I have to mention is that the Nintendo DS came with the same charging connector port that was on the Game Boy Advance SP. So effectively, I had two chargers for the same consoles, and I don't know, I just thought that that was funny, where I could have one charger at home at all times, and then another charger I could bring with me in like a little fucking mini DS Game Boy Advance bundle box or whatever, just a little carrying case. But the problem with this model of DS specifically is that it honestly wasn't very good. Now granted, I think this design of the Nintendo DS is hella nostalgic, and I genuinely love every aspect of it, minus, you know, the size of the screens. But I think it oozes this sort of nostalgic charm that isn't really matched by any other handheld, but the DS just doesn't look like what the DS's image ended up being. The DS eventually ended up being this sleek device that anyone can play and play all types of games on, and whether you're a pro gamer like me or grandma in the retirement home, you can find enjoyment on the Nintendo DS. But this model does not exude that same kind of energy. This model is pro gaming territory for the proest of pro gamers, me in 2004. So it's very funny to me to go back to the Nintendo DS, at least in its first iteration, and look back on eventually how everything all turned out and how Nintendo handled the launch of the DS and its eventual lifetime and its death later on when the 3DS launched. Honestly, in my opinion, all they needed was Metroid Prime Hunters, the demo, and Mario 64 DS. That was already good enough to show how powerful the DS was and how revolutionary the two-screen system was. But the DS never really took off until the release of the DS Lite. DS Lite signaled a sort of shift in design, a shift in direction from Nintendo at the time, where instead of being a powerful console for gamers to take anywhere they want, instead the DS Lite shifted its focus to the casual market and people who played games like Brain Age or Tetris or things like that. It's much easier to carry around this thing as a normal, you know, non-gamer type person than it is to carry around this thing. Like, imagine grandma trying to squeeze this thing into her purse, you know, like, she's just gonna get laughed out of the room. Imagine grandma going into a DS meetup with all the other grandmas and grandpas and whatever, and she pulls out this thing, and then they're all like, yo, what the fuck is that? Why you got the old DS, bitch? Oh, that is awful. That is fucking awful. But you know what? It's fine. Whatever. Not only being a significant change in direction for the DS, it was also just honestly kind of amazing how thin and compact they were able to get this thing. Like, you can see just how thin and just how compact they made the same console. I mean, obviously they had to take concessions. One of the biggest issues I had with this specific model of DS was just that the Game Boy Advance games were not flush with the rest of the console. So initially when you bought a DS Lite, it came with this little insert guy right here. And you can tell that it's a little bit shorter than a traditional Game Boy Advance cartridge. So when you stuck a Game Boy Advance game inside of a DS Lite, you know, you had this kind of fucking monstrosity inside. It was obvious at this point that Nintendo was trying to phase out the Game Boy Advance, but they held on for just a little bit longer, either due to fear of the DS brand dying, or some weird Nintendo-based backwards compatibility thing, which is honestly kind of funny to think about because Nintendo never really cares too much about backwards compatibility, but they did back in this generation. You gotta remember, this was right when the Wii was launching, or when it was brand new. Their whole thing with the Wii was backwards compatibility with things like the Virtual Console and GameCube game support. I mean, obviously, we had to eventually lose the Game Boy Advance slot, and we'll get to that, don't worry, but it was still cool to see that even though Nintendo was trying to make the DS Lite as compact and sleek and elegant as possible, they still managed to keep just that little bit of backwards compatibility. This was the most popular version of the DS, and this was the one that I always saw regularly out in public. I honestly didn't see a whole lot of people who had DSi's out in public, and even fewer that had this big guy right here. Everyone stuck with the Nintendo DS Lite. I'm assuming because it was just the most affordable. I could be wrong about that, but you know, whatever. Another thing that I noticed going back to this system, I don't know if this is true or not, but it seems like the Nintendo DS Lite has a bigger touchscreen. Like, I look at both of these screens closely, and I'm not really noticing that huge of a difference. But I don't know, maybe it's because the console itself is smaller, and I'm getting this sort of weird, optical illusion where it feels like the screens are bigger, but that's just kind of the feeling that I get. I think one of the funniest things about the DS Lite specifically is that it came with its own specific charger that nothing else before or since has accepted. The DSi switched to a completely different power cable, and that power cable from the DSi moved on to the 3DS and lived on throughout that entire line of consoles. So if you had a DSi or any of the 3DSs, you had a working power cable for it. But remember, the DS original came with the same power cable as the GBA SP, but this one came with its own cable. So this thing is only able to be used on a DS Lite. It's just this funny little thing that's unique to the DS Lite, specifically. I also want to point out how much better the stylus placement was on this system. So on the original DS, they had the stylus here in the back. And it's this thin, lanky, kind of a piece of shit, honestly. And you can, with my big man hands, I can barely hold it and play this thing properly. Like, it's honestly uncomfortable to me. I thought it was fine at the time, but obviously your hands grow as you grow older, but whatever. But here on the DS Lite, you had the stylus here on the side where your hand would naturally go, and you could just pull the stylus out with your hand, and it's much bigger, much longer, and easier to hold and use just for regular DS games. Actually, kind of a funny story about the DS Lite is I actually went through a few of them. So back in the day, I initially traded in my initial DS original model for a DS Lite, and I believe it was the white one. That was the first one that came out. And, I was the kid who always played the DS Lite on the bus and everything in the morning before school. And this was, middle school for me. And so I'm sitting on the bus. The bus is crowded as shit because the bus was always crowded as shit. You know how buses are laid out, where you had the aisle in the middle and the seats on either side, right? Well, I was sitting on the end of a seat because at the time it was 3 people to a seat because the bus was that fucking crowded. And I had my legs turned out toward the aisle of the seat because I just wanted to play my DS and just kind of, zone out and just enjoy my video game before I had to suffer through school. But when a kid was getting on the bus after a stop that I was already on, I had my legs out toward the aisle. So I had my DS in my hand, I saw him coming, and I thought, oh, let me put my DS away and move out of the way so everyone can come into the bus, right? This kid thought, no, I'm just gonna do this fast. I'm gonna place my hands on the seats of the bus and lift myself over and jump over the DS. Well, the problem was, when I was putting my DS away, I lifted it up slightly, and so he kicked the DS out of my hand, and it slid all the way down the aisle of the fucking bus. When it eventually got back into my hands, the hinge was fucked. And that's kind of a common thing that you hear when you talk about the DS Lite. A lot of people had problems with this fucking broken, weak, busted ass bitch of a hinge. It always broke, and it always made your DS not unplayable, but it made it so that the screen would flip and wobble and do all that stuff. Like, if you tried to hold your DS at any angle that wasn't down like this, it would just kind of fall forward and close the DS. So, not unplayable, but unplayable in enough situations to where it was a major annoyance. Another funny story, this was middle school again, and, I'm that kid who needs to have video games everywhere he goes, so I had my DS and about 9 games with me. And the middle school that I went to wasn't in the best of areas. So, you take a DS Lite, the biggest, most popular video game console ever, and you have 9 games with you in your bag, including Guitar Hero on Tour, because yes, I was that kid also. It was not really a recipe for success, and eventually my DS Lite and all of those games in my backpack got stolen from me. I actually got into a small fight with another kid in my class because he was laughing at me for freaking out that my precious Nintendo DS was stolen. That was the biggest thing for me, and to see my precious DS that has given me constant and endless hours of enjoyment and escapism just to be gone from me for no reason, and then to see someone laugh at me for that, I got a bit mad. So I threw a book at him, And because of that incident, I was called to the vice principal's office. And my vice principal really didn't give a shit that my stuff was stolen. I mean, why would she? So my mom was pissed, right? Effectively, the school was doing nothing to help in this case of theft from her child, especially from the thing that was basically the backbone of his happiness at the time. So my mom, being so mad, took me to GameStop and bought me another DS Lite. So I eventually ended up with a red DS Lite that was my DS until the end, up until when the DSi came out, where I traded it in to get the DSi, which I unfortunately don't have here today. But I can talk about all of its features and everything through the Nintendo DSi XL. Jesus Christ, look at how huge this thing is. Just compare the screens from the DSi XL to the regular DS, and it's night and day. Hell, let's compare the screens between the DS Lite and the DSi, and still the same thing. It's basically night and day. Now, before I actually talk about the DSi XL and how fucking comfortable it is, let's talk about the DSi features in general. A camera. Not only that, 2 cameras. Now that was a big deal. Even though I didn't personally use it all that much, it was still fun to play around with its camera and its editing features and all that software that came bundled in. That software alone made the cameras worth it in my eyes. Even though the cameras actually weren't all that great, they were still fun to play with. The coolest thing about the DSi, at least in my eyes back then, was that it looked like a portable Wii, and it felt like a portable Wii. And it mostly came down to the home menu. Under the hood, this is still just a normal DS. Like everything you can do on the regular DS and the DS Lite, you can do on this thing, no problem. But the thing that made it unique and the thing that made it feel like a portable Wii was its home screen. The little features and little bits of software and applets that you could play with, and the fact that the DSi had downloadable exclusive games for the system in the form of DSiWare. I'm thinking back to the few games that I played on the DSiWare specifically. I'm thinking of Flipnote, I'm thinking of Photo Dojo, I'm thinking of the $5 fucking calculators and calendars Nintendo tried to fucking charge us for. Whatever. It just felt more like a home console you could take with you. That's what made the DSi interesting in my eyes. And back then, I happily traded away my Nintendo DS Lite for a Nintendo DSi. Funny thing, I actually never owned a DSi XL. I already owned the regular, smaller DSi, and I thought, well, I mean, it's just bigger, so that means it's gonna be harder to carry around. Why would I want the bigger one when that would just make it harder on me? And I only got a DSi XL very recently. I actually picked up this DSi XL in its box with 10 games for $120 something bucks, maybe less than that. A great deal, honestly. And I would recommend that if you're looking to play just DS games, you're not interested in any of the 3DS or any of that stuff that happened later, you just want to play DS games on their own, I would highly recommend tracking down a DSi XL specifically. Because these screens are massive, they're gorgeous, the games scale really well, and the screens are actually IPS. What that means is that it is the highest quality type of screen that you can get on a portable device. These screens are better than any other handheld that I haven't modded myself. Because this Game Boy Advance SP uses the same IPS panel technology that is in the DSi XL. And this is my favorite way to play Game Boy Advance games, because it just looks gorgeous, and the games still look gorgeous on this thing. And these things are hella cheap, way cheaper than any 3DS you'd possibly be looking into that delivers this kind of quality in playing games. Obviously, you could spring for a new 3DS XL and get DS games, 3DS games, and Virtual Console and all that fun stuff, but if you're just interested in DS and looking back on this specific line of consoles, this is the one to go for. This is the definitive Nintendo DS console, at least in my eyes. But here's the thing, I love the first model of DS so much. It just has this nostalgic charm that can't really be matched by any other handheld. And that's just because of the time I played it and when I grew up and all that kind of stuff. So I like this one too much because of nostalgia, but this one delivers an objectively better experience. So, whatever, it's up to you to decide what kind of console you want to play and what kind of experience you want. But what kind of Nintendo YouTuber would I be and talk about the Nintendo DS line of systems and not talk about all of the fantastic games that came out for the console? I mean, I've already talked about my initial experience with the Nintendo DS, the first games that I've ever played on the console, but I've owned a DS pretty much all through its initial lifespan, so I've played a ton of DS games. And one of the biggest series that I played on the DS was the Mario and Luigi series, because I played the absolute shit out of Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga, and this is one of my favorite GBA games ever. So of course I had to get the sequels that came out on the DS later. Now, Partners in Time is kind of a divisive game in the Mario and Luigi series, but I personally love it. I love it to death. I love everything that they do with the time travel mechanics. I like how they incorporate the baby brothers into the older brothers' movesets and everything. I think it's a very interesting game, but a lot of people don't really enjoy it because of how easily exploitable some of the mechanics are. Like, by the end of the game, you're pretty much using one item to deal damage to every single boss in the game, because it's just the best way to deal the most damage in the shortest amount of time. So while this game was like divisive, even though I still loved it, Bowser's Inside Story, on the other hand, this might be the best game in the series. And when I got this DSi XL initially, the first game I played through on this device was Bowser's Inside Story, and let me tell you, this game still holds up flawlessly. How strange, a Nintendo fan who doesn't like RPGs yet absolutely thoroughly enjoys the Mario and Luigi series. Who would have seen that coming, right? But what DS video would this be if I didn't talk about the 3 games that everyone had on every DS? If you were a DS owner, you had one of these games. It didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter where you were from, it didn't matter what kind of games you enjoyed. If you had a DS, you had at least one of these games. Growing up, I had Mario Kart DS and New Soup because, you know, I'm a Mario fan and I'm a Nintendo fan, I had to have these games. And Brain Age I didn't get until like probably a year ago when my dad found this in a Goodwill. Like, I'm honestly surprised at how well Brain Age works to really get your brain moving and get your brain thinking. Now, do I think that it, you know, helps your brain and makes you smarter? I don't know. I think, you know, that kind of thing has to do with just your general workflow and your daily life and how well you interact with critical thinking and stuff like that. But yeah, whatever, beside the point. These were the 2 big ones, though. These were the ones that everyone had to have. New Super Mario Bros. Was a hit when it first came out. This was the first 2D Mario game to come out since, like, I think it was Mario Land 2, and that was like a 12-year gap. So this releasing at the time was a huge, huge deal. So huge, in fact, that Nintendo tried to do it again on the 3DS, and, you know, then they did it on the Wii, and then they did it on the Wii U, and then the series got super oversaturated and nobody liked it anymore. But if you look at New Super Mario Bros. On its own, in a vacuum, without the context of the future games, this is still a really, really solid 2D Mario game. Is this the best 2D Mario game? No, but you can't deny how huge of a hit this game was. And we haven't even started talking about Mario Kart DS, like the Mario Kart game that everyone played. And I think the reason why this game was so successful was because you didn't need to own a copy of this game to play it. So let's say, you know, you and a few friends are on the bus or at the playground or, you know, traveling, or you've got your family members or whatever, and you all have DSs, but only one copy of the game. Well, you can do some fucking voodoo magic called DS Download Play, where Mario Kart would send data to the other DS consoles and allow you to play the game without having to own it. You were forced to play as a shy guy, but you could still play Mario Kart, and that was the coolest thing ever. You had 8-player local wireless multiplayer, and only one of you had to own the game. The coolest fucking thing imaginable. It was also just a good Mario Kart game. You know, I still hold on to Double Dash being my personal favorite, but this one is also really fun to go back to, just for the memories of it and, you know, how Mario Kart was at the time. It also had mission mode, which no other Mario Kart game has had before or since. You know, I gotta admit that video games were always sort of a me thing. You know, nobody in my family or immediate vicinity besides my friends at school played video games all that much. So for the most part, when I was at home, it was just me playing a game with myself. So playing mission mode on Mario Kart DS gave me way more enjoyment of the game because I had way more to do by myself in single player. And before we move on to the 3DS line of systems, I actually want to talk about a few more games that just really stick out in my mind as the DS. So back on the Game Boy Advance, I was a big fan of Mario vs. Donkey Kong. Just kind of a weird continuation of Donkey Kong 94 on the Game Boy, the original Game Boy. You know, obviously I didn't know this at the time, but this was a very fun 2D acrobatic platformer, starring Mario, obviously. Maybe I'll do a review on this game one day. Maybe I won't, I don't know. I really like this Game Boy Advance game, but to see this just weird niche platformer back in the day evolve into a fucking spin-off of bullshit involving these little mini Marios was a little weird. See, I played Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2 March of the Minis because I thought it was just an interesting route to take. You know, they changed the game from a puzzle platformer to just a straight puzzle game, and I thought it was really interesting. I thought it was just a fun puzzle game in and of itself. But the thing that made me play this game as much as I did was the custom level creator. When I was a kid, any game that I played that had custom level creators or any sort of like custom level stuff in it just ate up so much of my time. And because this was portable, I could play this shit at a fucking restaurant and just, it was great. I love this game. The sequel, on the other hand, I didn't like as much because it was just the same as Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2 with a couple little bells and whistles added. But you know, we won't talk about the future of Mario vs. Donkey Kong. To me, this series is Mario vs. Donkey Kong 2 March of the Minis and the original on Game Boy. This is the series, these are the games you need to play. But speaking of custom levels and level creators and all that kind of stuff, the game that did this the best on the DS had to be WarioWare DIY. Oh my god, this game. So I've already played a ton of WarioWare games. I played Touched on the DS, I played WarioWare Twisted on the GBA, I played Smooth Moves on the Wii, but then when this one came out, I was like, oh shit, I can just make WarioWare games? Ooh! And I had to have it. I had to have this fucking game. And I think this is the DS game I've put the most time into. I've put a lot of time into a lot of different DS games because I just love the console that much. But this game in particular, this game ate up way more time than anything else. I honestly think it would be kind of interesting to pop open this cartridge again and take a look at some of those games that I still have on there. This is still my same cartridge that I've had since fucking middle school. So yeah, maybe I should do that. You know, get subscribed and that'll be a future video that we'll do here on the channel. Another little game that I want to bring attention to is the Sonic Rush series. Okay, so I'm a big fan of Sonic, right? And I didn't play the original Sonic Rush, you know, I only played Adventure, which is kind of a shame. I do want to get my hands on a copy of the original Sonic Rush. But this game was really fucking cool. So, confession time, as a kid, I wasn't the biggest fan of 2D Sonic. You know, I thought it just wasn't as fun as Sonic Adventure, or Sonic Adventure 2, or Sonic Heroes, or Shadow the Hedgehog. Yes, I was that kid. But going into Sonic Rush Adventure, this was really cool. This was just a fantastic 2D Sonic game that really did a good job of taking what would eventually become the Boost formula and making that work in 2D. So, you know, good game, whatever. That's pretty fun. But now we're gonna get into the games that I think are emblematic of the DS in general. When I think of the Nintendo DS, I think of these 4 games. First on the list, Tetris DS. Now, I've played a lot of Tetris games, right? I've played Puyo Puyo Tetris. I've played Tetris on mobile. I've played the fucking Tengen Tetris for the NES. I've played original NES Tetris. I played Tetris and Dr. Mario. I played GBA Tetris. I've played a ton of Tetris games. Tetris Attack even. But this one, I think is my favorite Tetris game. I think it's just because of its aesthetic and its art style and how it delivers the Tetris formula. Because you gotta remember, this was before Nintendo got super happy on the references and the retro revivals and all that kind of stuff. You know, back in the days of the DS and the GBA, retro revivals and retro references in a Nintendo game, in a mainstream Nintendo game, was a rare sight. You'd get maybe a few of them in some of their bigger games. Maybe you'd get a few in Mario and Luigi here and there. You know, it wasn't until New Super Mario Bros. Came out that all that retro revival shit started really taking off with Nintendo. But back then, it was cool to see. And this was the Tetris game that I had my biggest, longest, and most successful Tetris game ever on. And I forget exactly how high I got. I think it was like a 6 to 8 million points and like well over 1,000 lines. Baby numbers compared to what some people can achieve, but it was a big accomplishment for me. The next game on the definitive DS games, according to PaV, is Kirby Superstar Ultra. This is the best Kirby game. This is beyond being my personal favorite Kirby game. No other Kirby game achieves the same level of quality and quantity of content, side modes, bonus features, fucking cutscenes. Like, this is the entire package. If you're looking to play any Kirby game and you don't know which one to play, this is the one you need to play. I don't care if you have a cartridge, I don't care if you play it on an emulator, you need to fucking play this game. It is so goddamn good. When I got the DSi XL, I was thinking to myself, oh, you know, I'll play through Kirby Superstar Ultra again. You know, I remember really enjoying it, but it can't be that good, right? Like, I've played almost every single Kirby game out there, you know? Like, this one can't be the best. I was wrong. This one is still the best. Even though, I like Robobot. Robobot is really fucking good. This one is still my favorite. This one I think is still the best. Now, this one is the DS game. Like, this is my favorite DS game ever, right? Like, I have Kirby Superstar Ultra, I have Bowser's Inside Story, I've got fucking Tetris DS. All these games are fantastic, and I love them dearly. But no game has hit me as hard as Rhythm Heaven. If WarioWare DIY is the game that I put the most time into, I think this is a solid number 2, number 3 maybe. And I can't really pinpoint why it's one of my favorite DS games. It just is. I think rhythm games are really cool, and I've played a lot of really good ones, but they've just never been as creative, enjoyable, inventive, everything. This is my favorite rhythm game, period. And I've played Rhythm Heaven on the Wii, and that one tried to capture the same level of enjoyment, but I never quite reached the same level of enjoyment that I got on this specific copy. Now, unfortunately, I don't really have the cartridge anymore, just because this was one of those games that got stolen from me all those years ago. And the unfortunate part about Rhythm Heaven specifically is that it is $70 game only. So I'm gonna be saving up for that one. The final game that I want to bring up for the DS is one that I don't think would be expected, right? I don't think you would look at me and think, oh, that's one of his favorite DS games? What the fuck? Like, that's probably what you would think. Picross 3D. I don't even know why. Like, this was a game that I picked up on a whim, on a random visit to a Target or a Walmart or something. It was like 20 bucks. And I asked my mom, hey, can we get this little puzzle game? We were traveling to like a wedding or some shit, and we were staying at a hotel. I forget exactly why and where we were traveling, because I didn't care, right? But at that point, I was thinking, oh, well, let's see if I can grab another game before we leave, just to have something to play, you know? And I saw this game in the, glass shelf of like Target or Walmart, and I remember it being pretty cheap. I think it was like 20 bucks or so. And I asked my mom, hey, can we get this game? And she thought, hey, 20 bucks, a little puzzle game, sure, why not? and this is like one of my favorite DS games of all time. And it's just a fun little 3D Picross game. And I've played it a ton. This is one of those games that's like top 5 of the time I've put in of my playtime for DS games. There's so many puzzles you can do. There's so many different, little brain teasers and brain puzzles you can go through. And it has a custom puzzle creator. Now, granted, I didn't really use the custom puzzle creator all that much, but the fact that it was there was really cool. So, you know, it was just fun. It's just a fun fucking puzzle game. What else can I say? But now we move on a little bit. So eventually the DS line was overtaken by the 3DS line of consoles. I personally don't look back on the 3DS as fondly as I do the DS. Now, I don't know if that's because of, you know, a lack of nostalgia, or because a lot of the games just straight up weren't as good on the 3DS as opposed to the DS. I don't know. The main thing that I remember when I look back on the 3DS is Monster Hunter, because Monster Hunter 4 was the first Monster Hunter game that I played to death. Over the course of, I think, 2 3DSs that I've owned, I've played roughly 700 to 800 hours of Monster Hunter on a handheld that was just kind of a pain to hold. Like, the fact that I was able to play essentially one game for that long, I don't know. It's just, it shows how much I love that game and shows how much I love this series. I obviously played a lot of games on the 3DS, and I do have some standout examples that I want to talk about. But for the most part, when I think about the 3DS, I think mostly about Monster Hunter. Why wouldn't I? But real quick, I want to go over my history with the 3DS. Now, you might notice that I don't have a whole lot of 3DS consoles with me. And that's because over the years, what I did was I traded my way from the DSi to the 3DS when it came out on launch day. I was one of the guys who had the 3DS on launch day because I traded in my DSi. But that 3DS, the first model, I traded in to get the 3DS XL, which is this guy right here. We'll get to his tragic tale later. But eventually, I moved on from that 3DS XL to the new 3DS XL, which was this guy right here. Now, you might be thinking, well, where the fuck did these two come from? Well, the 2DSs came from my desire to do hacks and homebrews, and I purchased these specifically for hacks and homebrews. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let's start at the beginning. So I traded in my Nintendo DSi original for a first model 3DS, and I had it on launch day. And if you were there on launch day and you were playing the 3DS, you would know that there weren't that many games for it. But thankfully, the 3DS was backwards compatible with DS games, so in a sense, everything was fine for me. But then, the 3DS got a price cut. And with that price cut, eventually came the 3DS Ambassador program. So I am a 3DS Ambassador. So I have 10 Game Boy Advance games that are exclusive to the Nintendo Ambassadors here on this 3DS XL. Because of course I had to take all my data and transfer it from the first model to the XL to the new 3DS XL and everything. I've transferred all that data. And that's honestly why I'm not going to hack this 3DS. I might do it in the future, but I'm in no rush to really homebrew this because I want to preserve, you know, where I stopped playing the 3DS and all of my history with the 3DS. I want to preserve that. But, you know, in my trade-ups and trade-ins of all of my 3DSs, you know, I want to talk about this sad boy over here. So this is the Legend of Zelda Link Between Worlds Special Edition 3DS XL. This was the 3DS that I got on Christmas, whenever it came out. And I made a deal with my family that I would give them my smaller 3DS and I would keep this one, right? But in getting the Majora's Mask 3DS, my family asked me, well, you know, you already have a 3DS that you can play on, why don't you give your sisters this 3DS? And I thought to myself, I don't really want to because they're young, they were really young at this point, and they're gonna damage it, they're gonna break it, they're gonna do whatever, and I don't want that to happen. I want this thing to be preserved. And, you know, my dad eventually was like, give it to me then. And I thought to myself, you know, that probably wouldn't be as bad. And he was basically forcing me to give it to him. So I had to give it to him. And then he said, all right, little girls, you can play on the 3DS. And in doing so, they fucking destroyed it. And they popped this hinge off. And they ruined the screens and all that stuff, which hurts. It hurts to look at even to this day. but I know that this 3DS still works. I know it still turns on and we can access the data and everything. So eventually, I do want to get my hands on one of these again and transfer all my data from this to that and, you know, essentially rebirth it. Or maybe take the shell off and put it on another new 3DS or do whatever, you know? I want to get another one of these to put in the collection, you know? But that ain't happening anytime soon because one of these loose is like $200. So no thanks, I will handle that later. Honestly, the next one I want to talk about is this 2DS, this green gaming slab of wonder right here, because this one's actually a really funny story. So on Twitter one day, a great way to start a story, I know, I was following a man named Wario64 who tweets out a bunch of gaming deals and stuff like that all the time. And eventually he tweeted out that Nintendo was selling refurbished 2DSs for $50. And I thought, yeah, that sounds like a good deal. So I bought it, it arrived a little bit later, and now I have a official Nintendo refurb box for a 2DS. And I think this is far more interesting than just owning a 2DS on its own, because you can own whatever 2DS whenever you want just by getting it on eBay or going to a store at the time and buying it, right? But with this one, this is unique. This is a Nintendo refurb, an official Nintendo refurb. And I just think it's more interesting to look at this as a refurb and look at how, you know, Nintendo handles their official refurbs and everything. It's cool to have from a collector's standpoint. And I'm more than happy to own this one as a refurb over a retail version, which may or may not work, that I'd have to buy on eBay for a ton of money. And the 2DS itself was actually just kind of interesting to look at on its own because, look at it. It's the gaming slab, you know? You hold it like this and it's not a clamshell design anymore. It's just super interesting to look back on because, you know, the DS and the 3DS and even the Game Boy, they've always been clamshell. And I guess Nintendo wanted to make these as affordable and as durable as they could possibly make them, so they made it look like this. And at the time, this was only $100, or I think 150, around that range. And yeah, absolutely, it was affordable, and it was a fully fledged 3DS, just without the 3D and without the clamshell. So that's pretty cool, honestly. And I've played a few 3DS games on this, and I've put some time into this specific model, and it's actually not bad. Like, it's pretty comfortable to hold, even with my big, disgusting man hands. But then eventually, you know, I wanted to do a bit more homebrewing. And this was the first 3DS that I ever homebrewed. And this was my foray into handheld console homebrew and hacking and everything like that. And it was the initial catalyst for the Citra video that eventually came out a little bit ago. But it was cool. It was really cool to you know, dump games and put games on it and, you know, put a bunch of Game Boy Advance and original Game Boy games on it. It was cool. It was really, really cool. But, you know, it just wasn't cool enough. So eventually I got this guy. So this is actually far more interesting. This is a Japanese exclusive Minecraft new 2DS LL. You can't get this 3DS here, or 2DS, whatever. But remember, the 3DS is region locked, so that means this little guy can't play American 3DS games. Part of my homebrew and hacking for this thing, I changed its region. So its language is in English, it can play American 3DS games, and it can do everything I possibly wanted. The only thing that I can't do on this one is connect to services like the Nintendo eShop or any online service or whatever. And I think that's because I fucked up the region changing process or because my internet's just being weird. It could be either of those, right? But honestly, I don't really care about the online features of a fucking 3DS. I'm just gonna play offline games. And if I wanna put games onto it, well, I have this guy to dump 3DS games that I buy physically, and eventually I'm probably gonna hack this guy, and so I can dump all the games that I buy digitally. And honestly, for the most part, I wanna buy 3DS games physically, just because I wanna own the actual cartridges. But the piece de resistance, and I think, you know, not so much the crowning achievement of the collection, but just the most notable 3DS in my collection, as it was my personal 3DS for a long time. Now, you know, if you're trying to get this specific new 3DS XL, you're gonna be having to shell out a pretty penny for them. They're rare, Nintendo didn't make a whole lot of them, and that was emblematic of when I actually bought it. Fun fact, I actually played this 3DS so much that I wore out the paint on the sides right here and right here, because whenever I was playing Monster Hunter, my hands always sweat really badly when I play games, but when I was playing Monster Hunter on this thing, you know, I had moments where my sweat was kind of stripping the paint off of the sides of the 3DS, so I had to buy a new backplate. This backplate is not the original one that came with it. It's actually from the other Legend of Zelda New 3DS XL that came out with the release of, I think, Triforce Heroes, the weird 3-player game that I never played. But yeah, just, you know, it makes my 3DS a little bit more unique, I guess. Funny story about how I acquired this 3DS though. So I'm a huge fan of Majora's Mask, right? Always have been. I think it's my favorite Zelda game, period. And when I heard that Majora's Mask 3D was coming out, I was beyond hyped. And I knew I had to have this Majora's Mask 3DS. So what I did was I got with my buddy Zach, who back in high school, we played a ton of Monster Hunter, we played a ton of Smash Brothers, all that shit. And we woke up at 4 or 5 in the morning and we went to Target and we waited in line. So we waited in line for a few hours. When we got there, there were already 2 guys waiting at that Target. So it was 2 guys first and second in line, I was third in line, then Zach was fourth, and a few other people started coming later. The Target employee came out and said, "Hey guys, you're here for the new 3DS drop, right?" And a lot of us went, "Yeah, absolutely we are." And so they said, "Okay, cool, that's wonderful, great. We have 5 of them." A lot of us were stunned. Wait, you have only 5 of them? And yeah, only 5 of them in the whole store. So 2 guys in front got their Zelda 3DSs. I got this one, and my buddy Zach got one, and there was 1 kid and his mom behind him that I think they also got one as well. But yeah, only 5 of them, and we were freaking out, like, holy shit, we got one of the only 5 3DSs at that store, and I'm very happy with, you know, keep holding on to this and keeping it. Eventually I do want to hack it, but that's not something that I want to get into right now. And this 3DS has all of my data on it from my first Nintendo 3DS. I transferred that shit all the way from the Model 1, the Cyan one that I had at the start, from the Legend of Zelda one over there to this one. Just, I have all of it on here. And I played a lot of 3DS, mostly Monster Hunter, obviously, but there are a few notable games that I played a ton of during this generation. I mean, obviously we had Ocarina of Time 3D. This was one of the big 3DS releases at the time, and arguably is probably the best way to experience Ocarina of Time. You know, if you get this running on Citra and you make it a single screen experience and you fix all the motion controls, I think it's the best way to experience Ocarina of Time 3D. It takes a little bit of effort, but I think it's worth it. And the same cannot be said about Majora's Mask 3D, which, you know, I'm not the only one to say this, but this one's kind of poopy, kind of stinky, and it's just not good. They ruined a lot of the bosses, they sanded down all the sharp edges and made the game less unique of an experience overall. You know, just kind of a weird way, and one that I would not recommend to someone who's playing Majora's Mask for the first time. And the other notable 3DS game that I have to talk about is Kid Icarus Uprising. Holy shit, this game is fantastic. But here's the problem with it. Like, everything is fucking flawless about it. It's writing, its characters, its gameplay, its loot system, its stage design, everything. It's so good. But your hands explode while you're playing it, because it's another one of those games where you need to have the stylus in your hand and control your aim on the touchscreen down here and shoot with one of the shoulder buttons. Back when I first played this game, it felt totally fine. I did not see what everybody was complaining about with how their hands were hurting from playing this game. Nowadays, I unfortunately do see it, and I've tried to make it work on Citra. I've tried to make it work. I used the fucking Steam controller to make it work. But unfortunately, that did not end up working out. So, I don't know. I really want Kid Icarus Uprising to come back because at this time, it is locked to this one 3DS console. And it's played in a way that isn't really all that comfortable to a lot of people. And I think that's a huge shame. Still one of the best 3DS games ever made, and one of, probably my favorite, aside from Monster Hunter 4, obviously. And there are a ton of 3DS games I could talk about, like Metroid Samus Returns, which I just played, this year. Fucking phenomenal. I love that game to death. There's Kirby Planet Robobot, there's Kirby Triple Star, or whatever the fuck that game is called. I personally enjoyed Binding of Isaac on the 3DS. What else did I play? There's obviously Mario Kart 7, Star Fox 64 3D, Super Smash Bros. Was a big thing for me at the time. But honestly, this video's gone on for way too long already, and my throat is starting to fucking hurt. So anyway, this has been a very long-winded excuse to talk about my collection of DS's. One of these days, I will own one of each model of all the DS's and 3DS's. I'm missing the regular DSi, I'm missing the first model 3DS and all the other, weaker models of the 3DS and all that stuff, but I'm very close to completing my collection, and, that'll be really cool to eventually get one day. But for the time being, this was fun to sort of go back and look over the history of the DS and just sort of talk about, my experiences with it, my other little stories that I could talk about. I don't know, this was fun. I want to give a special shout out at the end to the executive lads who support me on Patreon. Thank you again for making all this possible. On my Patreon, you can gain access to videos a day early, special behind the scenes and bonus content. If you are on my Patreon, you would be able to see the first recording of this video, because yes, this is my second time recording this fucking video, and if you want to see the scrapped version of this that I can't go anywhere with because its audio is shitty, you can go support me on Patreon, get a link to that, and watch that and enjoy it. We have fun times on the Patreon. But anyway, this has been my long-winded ramblings of the Nintendo DS and 3DS. I hope you enjoyed, and I hope you have a good one.